Welcome all to my presentation on neurodivergence and kink. I'm CJ, I'm a therapist working within an NHS talking therapy service. I also do guest lecturing and workshops, and I'm a trustee for a trans and non-binary charity called Beyond Reflections. This presentation is aimed at therapists and professionals working with neurodivergent, kinky clients. It could be useful for anyone interested in this subject area though, and as it's just around 15 minutes, I've focused on the positive links between neurodivergence and kink. So I'll be looking at some definitions and language, those links between neurodivergence and kink, and some implications for practice. And just so you're aware, the images I've used are from stock image websites, and any experiences I'm sharing with permission from the people who have shared them with me. Starting with some definitions. Neurodiversity is a natural and valuable form of human diversity. Much of the research over the years and media representation of neurodivergence has been pathologising and infantilising, particularly when it comes to sexuality. The neurodiversity movement that began in the 90s aimed to move away from this and towards equality, respect and inclusion of neurodivergence. Often neurotypical ways of being are favoured in our society, and neurodivergent people can be held to neuroconventional standards, often leading to the pathologising of neurodivergent ways of being, ways of connecting and relating. Neurodivergence is a naturally occurring difference in brain function that can impact a person's experience of living in a predominantly neurotypical world. A lot of the research in the area of kink I've found tends to focus on autistic experiences, so the main focus of this presentation will be on autistic experience, but I did want to acknowledge the broad spectrum of neurodivergence. And some definitions around kink and BDSM. So kink is a way of exploring sexuality through things like role play, BDSM and fetish. And in research, it's often considered like unconventional by mainstream sexual norms. And BDSM falls under the kink umbrella. It refers to practices that involve collaborative power play, the exploration of movement and sensation. BDSM practices require explicit communication, risk awareness and informed consent, perhaps using the RAC model, risk-aware consensual kink. And BDSM doesn't always involve genital stimulation. It might involve power play or impact play with no genital touch. And BDSM stands for bondage, discipline and dominance, sadism and submission, and masochism. The Leather Couch book has a Venn diagram that shows various BDSM practices and how they can overlap. So perhaps there may be different forms of power play taking place, different forms of communication before, during, after a play session, different sensory experiences, pain, play and marking, being bound and gagged, for example. BDSM can encompass a range of forms of play and practices. Having multiple marginalised identities can lead to multiple forms of discrimination. Neurodivergent, kinky people can experience double discrimination and aren't always believed. They're often infantilised and desexualised, as mentioned before. When you receive this message from society and those around you that your neurodivergence and sexual identity are not compatible, this can understandably impact mental health. It's stigmatising and pathologising. When autistic sexuality is viewed through a neurotypical gaze, it's something that is seen to be needing to be fixed, and this has been the subject of much of the research in previous years. But there is a growing movement towards a more neuroaffirming perspective. In the book exploring autistic sexualities, relationships and genders, the authors speak of ways that kink can provide space where autistic people can be authentic and accepted for who they are. The authors also spoke about ways kink can provide space to explore our bodies and pleasures within neurodivergent ways of communicating and processing. It allows for non-speaking communication, clear communication, safety protocols and connections based on interests. Within kink contexts, autistic ways of being may feel less pathologised. For example, a meltdown may instead be referred to as a drop within the BDSM community and is something that can happen regardless of neurotype. A drop is an intense physical and or emotional experience that can follow a scene, and it can happen to anyone. This is backed up by recent research. Pearson and Hodgetts conducted qualitative research into kink from the perspective of autistic adults, and they found 3 key themes. The first was practicing safe sex, which specified a kind of clear communication, explicit focus on consent that BDSM can offer, and this enabled a facilitation of feeling of safety for participants who otherwise found uncertainty during sex and intimacy very stressful. The second is so many ways to touch and be touched, providing potentially exciting ways to explore sensory joy or sensory revulsion. And then subverting neuronormativity. Autistic people can find pleasure in intimate practices other than what might be considered the usual. Another paper speaks of the reasons autistic people may be drawn to BDSM. The first one was engaging in BDSM as a form of stimming and sensory regulation, a preference for literal and concrete language, and providing engagement in community and support for long-term learning and communication, providing opportunities to explore special interests, for example. And the fourth was the double empathy problem, which can result in the marginalisation of autistic people in mainstream society, while the BDSM communities can offer norms better suited to autistic people. In the book Autistic Sexualities, Relationality and Genders, they speak of various elements that make BDSM and kink a home for neurodivergent people. The first area was embodiment, and they say that this is a state or practice of being fully present and connected to one's body, emotions and experiences. It's a way to explore sensory pleasures and can help align the physical body with our identities. And one of the authors shared, it endorses the exploration of complex emotions and physical experiences in intense focus and flow. BDSM is one of the few practices that allows for all of me to exist at the same time. Another area is fusing, and they suggest this means where a self merges with the self of others, and that BDSM can involve collectively engaging in an activity while in hyperfocus. Some might call that headspace. And when engaging in a neurotypical world, fusing can come as a great relief and allows for connection with the authentic self. And again, one of the authors shared their experiences and said, desire alters my state of mind and opens a door for exploration of experiences that are sometimes otherworldly. While my self dissolves, it also expands, merging with my actions and with the intentions, feelings and physical sensations of my partner. Autistic fusing captures the intense intimacy, trust and connection and love explored in BDSM experiences, in contrast to cultural representations of autistic people as unable to experience profound connection and love. Another area was stimming. Stimming being a sensory input that allows for regulation of overwhelming experiences. And as suggested in the previous research as well, BDSM can be a form of stimming and it can bring sensory joy. And I had a person share their experiences with me of shibari, which is rope tying. And they said, I enjoy the process and there's an art to it and a skill, and I like the look of peace on the other person's face once the intricate knots have been tied. I often realise I haven't been thinking about anything else and I can focus on this one thing longer than I usually can with anything else. And another person shared their experience of being tied up. And they said, the pressure of the rope on my body feels amazing. I also like to be sat on and get such a sense of calm when I'm in a vac bed. It's like using a weighted blanket. All the stress just leaves my body. Another area was connection, and the authors suggest connection offered when someone chooses to explore their physicality with you, and it doesn't need to be sexual. Not all kink and BDSM practices involve sexual intimacy. And somebody shared their experiences with connection within the BDSM community, and they said, my dom whips me until I have no thoughts in my head. It's so freeing. Afterwards he holds me while I cry. It's such an emotional release, and it's the only time I cry, really. I feel connected to myself and my dom in a way that I don't experience elsewhere. And lastly is communication. And the authors say that generally in mainstream sex there tends to be an underlying assumption of what is expected during sex, and communication about consent is considered something that perhaps ruins the moment. However, as noted previously as well, that many neurodivergent people require explicit communication and feel that this is an essential part of their sexual self. And also that communication prior to and after a scene is important and is standard practice generally within BDSM. And aftercare normalises sharing of introspection and self-reflection, allowing for communication of that embodiment and that embodied self. And it allows for the authentic self to find ways of expression. It's something that's perhaps always evolving, and something that autistic people may not always get to explore in wider society. And another person shared their experience of the kink scene, and they said, I know the rules, and everyone else knows the rules because they're communicated explicitly. No one's trying to figure out what's going on. I've always found dating and sexual stuff difficult to navigate, but here consent is explicit, I feel safe, and I know how to be while I'm there. And looking at implications for therapy practice, in their paper Expressions of Queer Intimacy, BDSM and Kink as a Means of Self-Actualization, Mazaks offers some practical steps that can be taken to become a kink and neuroaffirming therapist. The first one is recognising areas for growth and reflecting on your values and beliefs and assumptions about neurodivergence and kink, and identifying potential biases. Reading resources like clinical practice guidelines for working with people with kink interests, and making use of specialised supervision and mentoring to aid in your growth as a therapist when working in this area. And these all form part of a cultural competency for working with neurodivergent kinky clients. Some further implications for therapy practice. Queer and kinky people wanted therapy that is free from stigma, preferably with a queer and kinky therapist, and free from normative assumptions. Another paper found that creating an open and supportive environment was important, actively helping clients seek out safe and healthy ways to explore their sexuality, and viewing each person holistically and collaborating with them in creating viable pathways to a fully realised sexual expression in the least restrictive way possible, and then exploring from a validating perspective, acknowledging and exploring alternative ways of being intimate. And when we are thinking about therapy and how it might work with neurodivergent kinky clients, we need to hold in mind that our neuronormative society has often restricted autistic people's access to services. So when Accessing services and during therapy, autistic clients' level of disclosure can depend on their perception of how neuroaffirming the therapist is. And GSRD autistic affirming therapists will walk with their clients as they embark on journeys of discovery, fostering genuine curiosity and understanding of each person's goals and values. Having space to fully understand and unpack the client's social systems, learning context and media representations, allowing space for unlearning and unmasking, and finding a way of being that enables freedom from performativity, and developing terminology that better mirrors autistic embodied experiences. Autistic people have a right to have a rich and expansive sexual life, and kink can be a part of that. And working from a kink and neuroaffirming approach is important when working with this client group. Thank you for listening, and I hope there has been something useful you can take from this presentation. The following slides are the references.